All right, hello. We're going to talk about Russell. The first thing I need to talk about before we get to Russell, though, is the linguistic turn in philosophy. Um, this is really attributed to Gottlieb Frege, 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 um, and he really changed the whole way that epistemology is done, because his claim is that we don't look at ideas or representations or any of those things that Hume and Kant and Locke and Descartes, they're too amorphous and too difficult to understand what you mean by idea. Let's instead look at statements, okay? Now, Frege, he's a super important guy, by the way. He invented modern logic, which is what all of your devices run on. I mean, he's actually the most famous person you've never heard of. But anyways, he's a logician, and his whole logic is binary, like computers. True or false, there's two values. Statements are either true or false. So let's just look at statements. Rather than ideas, okay, statements. Is the statement you have before you true or false? The cat is on the mat. Is it true? Is it false? Well, to determine that would require that we address the question of meaning, okay? What does the statement mean, and how does that statement connect up with reality? Now, this is actually still a very philosophical question. How do your words reach out and touch the world? That's a philosophical question, okay? Sorry, it may sound like it's kind of concrete, but not so much. It's pretty magical how that happens. Well, at least it is now. Maybe we'll figure that out in the future, but it's pretty incredible how we're able to say things about the world around us and they either match or they don't match. So the cat is on the mat. Is it true or false? That's the only question we need to address. We don't need to talk about ideas generally. And that makes sense, because if you're talking about epistemology and knowledge, right? Knowledge is true statements. Knowledge is about truth and true statements. So let's focus exclusively on true statements and what makes a statement true or false. Now, Frege argued that there were two different things that constituted meaning: sense and reference. I'm not going to go into that argument here. One key thing is reference, though. The statement refers, okay, the words in the statement refer to things in the world. So the word cat refers to a cat, the word mat refers to a mat. For the statement to mean anything, the words, those nouns have to have a reference. Sense, generally speaking, is what allows for reference to happen. This is very similar to connotation and denotation, if you've ever heard of that before. Now, why am I talking about Frege? Well, because Russell was friends with Frege. Okay, so Bertrand Russell was friends with Frege. He's an interesting and famous character. I'm not going to do his biography, but if you ever look it up, it's pretty fascinating. Friends with Einstein. I mean, the guy he's a pretty important character. Anyway, and his philosophy was not consistent throughout his entire life. His career was super. The guy lived to be like 100 years old, and he had a long, long career. So his philosophy did change over time, but it seems to kind of always come back to his empiricist view. I mean, he'd go off on one direction, but he seems most consistently in his life he was an empiricist. And that's what's presented in Problems of Philosophy, which is kind of his short, I don't know, most easy to read book. And that's what I assigned. Now, so this is my notes on Russell. Is anything certain? He talks, okay, so that's where he begins. And I'm not going to go through this in detail either. Look, if you read through his discussion of the table and what we know about the table, it's very, very much the kind of thing that Locke and Hume and other empiricists say. Knowledge is gained through experience. And how do we experience? With our senses, right? With our five senses. Notice he talks about how it looks and how it sounds and how it feels, that kind of thing. And then he says, the real table is not immediately known, but is inferred. Is there a real table there? And what is it? We don't know. What we do know is our sense data. Okay, this is kind of a technical term from him, even though it's not that technical. I mean, it is what it sounds like. The data that we get from our senses. That's sense data. So the information you receive from your senses, that's sense data. Okay, that's what we immediately know. Objects like the table are inferred from what we immediately know. That is what we sense. Okay. Now, knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description is where the rubber hits the road here a little bit. Like this is like the central idea in problems of philosophy and Russell's philosophy. So there are things we know by acquaintance. Acquaintance is things that are immediately known. Our direct awareness, like sense data. Whereas knowledge by description is things we derive or infer from that knowledge that we get from acquaintance. Like the table is a physical object, is an example, which we get from sense data. Now, notice, going back to what I was saying earlier, how does this connect up with the linguistic turn and philosophy focusing on language and meaning? Well, a description is a sentence, a statement in words. So how do we get to understanding that description and evaluating that whether that description, that statement is true or false? Well, Russell's answer is that we do that on the basis of what we know by acquaintance. What are we acquainted with? Our sense data, here, now, like what you see, what you feel, what you hear, your senses. Also your memory, what you've seen, heard, tasted, in the past. Introspection, okay, so your self-consciousness about your thoughts and feelings, mental things. In other words, this is very much like Locke's ideas of reflection, very similar to that, things we experience in our own minds. We also know of ourself. Okay, so you know yourself, your I, you know your own self, not other people. Okay, only yourself. Notice that. So I know I know my own self by acquaintance. The only way I know you or anybody else is by sense data. I hear you. I see you. I touch you. That's not acquaintance. That's sense data, and that's going to be something that I infer and have descriptions about. He says we probably know our own selves because when I say I see the sun, it makes sense. Notice how this works, the linguistic part of it. I say I see the sun, that sentence makes sense, and therefore all the elements of the sentence that are nouns have to refer to something. We know what the sun is, you look up at it, you can see it. But the word I must have a reference as well, and therefore I must be acquainted. I don't sense my own mind, but I must be acquainted with it because otherwise that sentence wouldn't make any sense. Interesting how he's arguing this, right? It's based upon the language and the fact that language can only function when the words have a reference, something to refer to, something to point to. Well, I must point to something, and I don't know it by sense data, so it must be something I'm acquainted with. And by the way, he says the same thing about concepts, or that's general terms like trees or buildings or cars. I haven't seen every car or building in the world, but I do have this word cars makes sense, so I must know it somehow. So Russell chalks that up to acquaintance as well. So we know universals. Think back to Plato, you know, universals by understanding these concepts through acquaintance. All right. So that's what we know by acquaintance. What we know by description? Well, physical objects and other minds. So all the objects in the world and all the other people in the world, we know all of that by description. By the way, notice it seemed like there were quite a few things on the list of things we knew by acquaintance. You know, I know sense data, I know my memory, I know my introspection, and it seemed like there were quite a few things there. The only thing we know by description is everybody and everything. I mean, in other words, pretty much the whole world is known by description, right? Come on. All other things in the world and all other people are known by description. And we know whether they're true or false, these descriptions, by measuring how they relate to the things we know by acquaintance. So our sense data, the things we get from sense data or introspection, etc. Okay. Now, I do want to mention his theory of descriptions, which is very famous. Okay. This is actually way more famous in terms of logic than it is in terms of philosophy in general. I kind of got to note that. I mean, he's solving a major logical problem about reference with this theory of descriptions, theory of definite descriptions in particular. But see, since we know the world pretty much through descriptions, and that's important. And add to that, definite descriptions are the most important of all of them. He talks about an ambiguous description, a so-and-so. But when we are actually trying to state facts about the world, whether they're true or false, that's what he calls a definite description. It's called definite because the word "the" is the definite article. Okay, that's grammar. So "the" means definite. That's why it's called the theory of definite descriptions. The so-and-so is, the table is wooden, the door is brown. I don't know what, when you say those things, you're making a true or false statement. Russell thinks that definite descriptions are the most important thing to talk about, because that's when we're stating true facts about the world using definite descriptions. All right. How do definite descriptions work? Okay, so he goes on into this pretty elaborate discussion of this. We got merely definite descriptions. We've got the key thing here is the second this line. A definite description must always pick out one specific object. That's the key thing to try to capture with a definite description. I mean, if you're describing something, it must pick out that thing you're describing and nothing else. When you say the car is blue, it has to pick out that car, refer to that one car. When you say the first president of the United States was George Washington, it has to refer to that one guy. Sorry. So it has to pick out one specific object. We might know it by acquaintance, okay? So it might be, if you're talking about your friend, you can refer to your friend because you know him, you've met him, you've seen him, you heard him, you've touched him, whatever. That's kind of unproblematic. The thing that gets it more tricky is when it's something that you don't know personally. And this is where he starts to talk about proper names. Proper names for Russell are just veiled descriptions. Okay, so a name is just an abbreviated version of a description. Who is Mr. Johnston? Well, he's the guy trying to make a video and hopefully making sense right now. That's me. But that description is what you understand about me. And it can vary because, someone else, my father will have a different description of me. The guys at the coffee shop where I grade papers all the time probably have a different description of me. Well, I used to grade papers. Anyway, so proper names are just descriptions. You're describing someone you know. And if that's fine, that it varies. My father's description of me is different from your description of me, as long as it continues to pick out the same person or object. I can just refer to myself because I know, like I said, I know myself, but everybody else has to refer to me by description. So you either know me by having sense information, seeing me, hearing me, which by the way, you are seeing and hearing me by right now. This is not just note, we're not having a mind meld or something. You're seeing and hearing me right now. All right, so okay, so any description that picks out a reference must at some point be based upon something known by acquaintance to particulars. All right, often a testimony written or heard. Now, this notion of testimony is important. So we can talk about people we've never met or even seen or heard or anything. So George Washington, first president, I mentioned him before. I never met him. You never met him. Nobody ever met him that's alive today. How do we know anything about him? Because we have descriptions of him in language that come from people that have or did see or hear him, and they recorded it. So it was their immediate experiences that allowed us to know anything about people like George Washington. Okay, and as he says, there's various stages of removal. Someone you personally know versus a particular historical figure, etc., etc. The definite description will work as long as it manages to pick out one particular individual or thing. Okay, this is not just people, it's objects as well. And if it does that, then we can say something true or false about it. All right, I guess I'll just briefly mention what is the logical background that I was trying to mentioned earlier? Well, one of the strange things in trying to use this logic of true and false is how do you talk about something that does not exist? Because if every sentence has to have a reference, that is every word, every noun in the sentence has to have a reference, how do you talk about something that doesn't exist? Ghosts are white. There's no ghosts. Well, maybe there are, but his example is the present king of France is bald. Okay, there is no present king of France. They cut the guy's head off a couple hundred years ago. They don't have kings. So the present king of France doesn't refer to anything. And yet the statement, the present king of France is bald, seems to be a meaningful statement. So how is that possible? The way Russell's solving this is by saying the present king of France is a description, and all you're doing is trying to see if something meets the description or not. And since nothing meets the description of the present king of France, it's false. Even though there's no reference, it's false, and therefore the statement can be meaningful. Frege, by the way, tried to take the other approach and say everything was a proper name. And Russell seems to have a better plan by saying everything's a description, and you just look to see whether the description meets up in the appropriate way with reality. Okay, now the importance of this is that description is going to allow us to know things that we don't personally experience. Now, you might note that Locke and Hume seemed clearly to assume that you can get information from other people's experience and what they tell you and communicate to you in their empiricist viewpoint. This is an empiricist viewpoint that Russell's putting forward here. But neither Locke and Hume did a very good job of explaining how that worked. How do you get knowledge from other people's experiences? Russell has an answer. He put it in words. It's a description. The description is true or false. Is it based? How is it based? Is it based upon their acquaintances? Is it based on their experience? If it is, then you can still make judgments about things that you do not personally know. And this allows us to know a lot more about the world, as he says. If I only had acquaintance to rely on, things I was acquainted with, then my knowledge of the world would be very limited. But I can draw upon other people's experiences as well. All right, so empiricism, yes, very much this, kind of more like Locke than Hume, by the way. Paired with, integrated with this theory of language that meaning is important, reference in particular, words, a word has to have a reference to have a meaning, at least a noun does, and then you can evaluate whether things are true or false based upon what you're acquainted with and what you've heard from others who, if they were acquainted with it. And you can evaluate whether it matches up with the things you've sensed, you're acquainted with, or what other people have sensed or acquainted with. Okay, that's the basics of Mr. Russell. Good luck.